I'm always telling folks we're trying to move over to this idea of shared and balanced power dynamics where you are a partner in the process and you are literally on a strength finding mission where your mission is to find the strength in this family and partner with them to add to that strength.
All right. Hello and welcome back to the Partnership Connections podcast. This podcast is centered around child welfare training and educational topics, all with the goal of helping to support those already working in or with an interest in working in child welfare. My name is Stan Brazier and I'm the project director for the learning partnership between the Rhode Island Department of Children, Youth and Families, or DCYF, and Rhode Island College. Our desire is to bring information from experts on a variety of topics, all at no cost to hardworking professionals and others. Joining me again today as our co-host is Holly Pacheco from DCYF. Holly, good to see you as always.
Good to be back, Stan.
We haven't seen each other too much this week. It's been a little quiet. Normally it's like we just got off a meeting or we saw each other like 2 hours ago, but not as much this week. We saw each other yesterday. That's okay. It counts, right? So welcome. Good to have you again. And before we begin, quick disclaimer that all the thoughts and views expressed by both the guests and hosts do not necessarily reflect those of the organization or institution that they might represent. So today we're very excited to have a special guest with us that has both firsthand experience and a wealth of knowledge of systemic factors facing child welfare. Dr. Jessica Price is a research faculty member at Florida State University and works directly with child welfare leaders through the Florida Institute for Child Welfare on organizational change through the Alliance for Workforce Enhancement under the Institute's GROW Center. She is also the author of Broken, Transforming Child Protective Services, Notes of a Former Caseworker. Dr. Price, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the show.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you. We appreciate when everyone takes time out of their very busy schedule. So would you mind do us the honor of starting by telling us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about maybe your personal journey that led you to becoming a social worker and even more specifically, someone that's worked in child protective services?
Sure. So I studied sociology in college. And I think a lot of people who study sociology realize when they finish that they don't really know what else to do after that. It's not a terminal degree. So I remember taking a course during my senior year, and the professor was an adjunct, and he was also a social worker, and just really got inspired after taking his course to pursue social work. Hadn't really heard a lot about that field, but after that, I applied to get my MSW. And during my MSW journey, there were opportunities to receive Title IV-E funding. People that are listening to this may be familiar with that funding stream where you have your tuition paid for and really most things are taken care of. But in response to that or repayment of that is to go into child protective services for 1, sometimes 2 years to somewhat repay back the funding you received. So when I heard about that opportunity, I thought, this sounds great. I'd love to work with children and families. And again, did not know a lot about CPS at that time. But that was really my journey into social work and my journey into CPS. I joined that program, did an internship with CPS. And as many of you know, if you intern with CPS and you do really well and you're remotely interested in doing the work, the department is certainly going to, bring you on. So I was hired after that, and I became an investigator here in Florida.
Well, thank you for that. It sounds like maybe you didn't really have that many preconceived notions or thoughts about what getting into child protective services or child welfare would look like.
I did not, but I recounted in the book that when I started telling people that I was going into CPS, their reactions they were pretty stunning. People were saying things like, "Are you sure you want to do that? All they do is take kids, nobody likes those people." So it was interesting that I didn't have my own preconceived notions, but the reactions of others was very telling.
How did that make you feel? Like, did that give you any interpretation, or were you like, I'm not sure how to interpret that?
Honestly, I almost wanted to prove them wrong. I said, no, this is going to be fine. I get to help kids. I get to keep them safe. I get to work with families. And so I think that my initial reaction, like a lot of us, is, no, you're wrong about that. And I'm going to show you how wrong you are about that. But honestly, I think they were somewhat correct with their perception of how society, how communities view the CPS system.
That's funny because when I told my mom that I wanted to try to pursue my MSW, with not having really not really having a lot of information about what social work actually was, but going to pursue an MSW, my mom was, I would say, fairly concerned. She was a teacher for many years, and she mentioned red tape. And similarly, I think I probably had feelings of, well, it's fine. Like, I want to help people. I think I can do this. She wasn't totally wrong, right? There is a lot of red tape and a lot of bureaucracy, and it has been frustrating, but it's been, just as rewarding. And I do not regret the decision to pursue that degree and become a social worker. So I can kind of relate in that aspect. But I wanted to jump into some of the things that you talked about in your book and some of the things that you've, been working on and sort of, some of the history you've experienced and like what things may look like today and how things have changed and how you're working on changing some systems. But one thing you mentioned was ideal circumstances versus real life situations and the differences between training and being actually on the job. In your view, how effectively do you think current child welfare training efforts are preparing professionals for the actual complex reality of practice, and where might you see like the biggest gaps? And what approaches do you think training could take to be more reflective of real life situations?
So this is a great question because I think training has evolved from when I was in the field, but we've done research within the last 2.5 years, at least here in Florida, on that transition from training to on the job. And we continue to see the data reflect that it's just not representative of what they're getting into. So we hear a lot of respondents giving us survey information around, well, I do this 9-week training and I do field days. There's field days trickled throughout the 9-week training, but then they get to their job and their colleagues start saying, okay, forget about what you learned in that training. It's time to really learn the job now. And that can be very frustrating and overwhelming for a new professional. And that's what we're learning here in Florida. As early as 2.5 years ago, we were able to follow a cohort of child welfare professionals, over 1,000 of them. And we followed them for over 4 years to really see their training and then on the job transition and then how long they lasted in the field. Very few of them lasted past 18 months, but we still followed them even when they left the child welfare field because we wanted to see where they went. We really wanted to get a sense of, when you leave CPS, where do you go and why? So it was a fascinating project and a longitudinal study to really see that transition. So as far as gaps, I believe that we're going to have to look at training differently. I think that a 9-week block of training, or even 8 weeks, some people are shortening it, is just not the best approach to this. I think that some people are getting pretty innovative, where you come in for 2.5 weeks and then you're in the field for 2 weeks, and then you do more training for a few more weeks. So I think a gap could be just trying to overhaul the way training is done right now, and maybe just being innovative and creative and different about how they're preparing professionals.
Yeah, I know in Rhode Island here we have pretty intensive training probationary period where I think it's like 28 weeks, I think, in total. They're not in training the entire time, but that's sort of, they're considered their like probationary period, right? So there is, it's pretty involved, it's pretty comprehensive, but I think I would agree with you that like, there's certain aspects that could maybe be looked at as being tweaked, as maybe being like looked at as how can we make this a little bit more efficient or things like that. In your mind, do you feel the same way, even if it's a shorter time frame? Does it need to still be like more efficient in some way, or just make it make more sense and be more practical to the people that are actually doing the job? And I'm also curious, the research that you did, were there trends in where people left and why they left?
I think that for the study, people left because of role ambiguity. That was a big part of it, where they thought they were getting into the field to do a certain thing, but then they said, can't even do my job. They talk about red tape, right? They're like, well, I didn't come into this job to sit at a desk and create papers and write papers and not be able to really impact families. So I think that was what we learned a lot. We also learned about burnout, and that's not going to be foreign to the listeners. People were just burnt out. And that 18-month mark was hugely significant. That's where we started seeing people taper off. I've been able to partner with an agency here in Florida. Another part of my job that I get to do is I get to go into agencies and actually implement changes that they need. And I worked with an agency that decided to really focus on the first year and a half of the people that came into their organization. So the training went as normal, but they had some very intentional checkpoints, booster trainings, debriefing sessions for the first year and a half of a person on their job because of that data. They said clearly this first 18 months is intricately important for someone to stay on this job. So to your question of, what are the gaps? What can be done? I think people can sort of adopt new cohorts as they come into this field and take somewhat special intentional care of them during that first year and a half.
Yeah, it sounds like more robust support, more wrapping around them for a little bit longer than you normally might during that initial period to make sure that they have everything that they need. So it's good that the data showed that and people actually adapted to the data that was being presented. So you wrote about some pretty personal things in the book. You talked about deeply personal stories, including that of your sister. What was it like sort of to weave those personal experiences into a professional narrative, and how has that shaped your own understanding of child welfare work?
So I will start by sharing something I don't usually share, but when I wrote this book, I wrote it twice, basically. So I wrote a book, and it was me interviewing moms that have gone through this system. None of them I knew. It was very much, I'm the researcher, I'm interviewing you, and I want to highlight your story for this book. And I submitted that book to the publisher, and they thought this is a pretty solid book. But they said, how open are you to being a part of this story, like sharing your personal and professional experience when you did this job? That was not my intent. I did not want to do it. But I really came out of my comfort zone and decided to rewrite the book. So the book that you have now was a rewrite where, as you said, I decided to only include women who I had a connection to, whether it's personal or professional. So to your question, how was it writing this experience? It was very difficult in some ways, but what really pushed me forward was the eagerness of these women to get their stories out there, the eagerness of these women to say, actually, I do want to share what happened because I don't talk about this with anybody, and I didn't know that I could talk about it with anybody. And I think that's why I wanted to add that personal element. I also have a heart for the workforce. When I started my job as a CPS worker, within 6 months, my entire training cohort had been cut in half. So I knew early on that one of the most important jobs that exists are really hard to keep people. So I've always had this desire to impact the workforce. So I wanted to add that element to the second book, the second rewrite. The first book had not much about the workforce. It was focused on the moms in the story. But this rewrite had this workforce element of this system is harming families in many ways, but it's also harming professionals if we don't come at it in a different way and try to combat the burnout, the compassion fatigue, and the turnover that's really riddling the systems around the country. So that's why I brought that personal element. And I even talked about my own issues with burnout and my own mental health concerns, where I've had so many particularly distressing cases that I was leading as a CPS worker, and how sometimes you think that you're able to shoulder these things as a professional, but it became very clear in the book that I wasn't shouldering them the way that I thought I was, and they were really impacting me on a personal and really painful level.
Ollie, I think you might want to say something.
No, that's what I enjoyed about the book was your personal experience, and wasn't an investigator, but I was a social caseworker, and I could relate to so many of the things that you experienced, that you went through, and just the cases as well, just that personal experience that you knew them, whether it was your sister or your friend or a parent that you worked with, was what I could really relate to and what I really enjoyed in your book.
Yeah, I think that the case managers and social workers and folks that are very similar to you that have done this job. I hear that continuously. They say, I really appreciate you sharing that part of the work. And I almost didn't. So I'm so glad I did. And I think that seeing both sides, my goal wasn't to say, oh, one side is more important than the other. I just wanted to show the mindset of a case manager and an investigator, and also how the things that we're doing, we're meeting deadlines, we're doing our jobs, we're trying to take care of our own kids and our own mental health. But in the middle of all that, look how what we're doing is impacting a mom on our case. And that was my goal, to show it's almost, you can't always read a book and find a villain. And in my book, it's certainly not easy to find a villain, because I don't think that case managers and professionals are villains. But it's hard to miss how somebody can be merely doing their job, but how much it can harm a family.
Have you found that your own vulnerability and or the parents and moms that you wanted to highlight in your books, that their vulnerability has encouraged other folks to also want to share their story, whether it be from the family side or from the professional side? Is that opened up others' interest in sharing their own stories?
It has, particularly moms and dads, as in parents of kids that are in our system. They are really trying to get their lived experience out there and sharing that with others. I heard a reframe recently of living the experience. Some people are speaking out about something they're going through right now, concurrently with what their advocacy. So it's not just lived experience, it's also living the experience for some of these parents that are speaking out and really trying to not let what happened to them happen to another parent. In particular, one of the moms in my book, her name's Jatoya Potts, and she is a fierce advocate. And I particularly wanted to share her today on the podcast because I want folks to go and look at all the work she's doing. And it stems directly from what she went through. Right now, she's doing a big push on parental representation, like making sure that there's legal representation for parents going through this system, so their civil rights are not violated and their parental rights are not violated. So I think that it's important for what she's doing, even though she's carrying the grief of what happened to her and her family, but she's still trying to pave the way for other parents that are going to be impacted by this system.
Yeah, I really like that, because I don't think I've ever heard that term, living experience. You so often hear lived experience as if that happened to you already, and so now you're better, right? Like now you can move on, and you can talk about that and share that with people, and that'll maybe help some other people. But you're done, right? You're good. And I think that we often don't, take the time to really invest in people that are actively experiencing these systems and actively experiencing things that are happening to them, speaking out and feeling empowered and feeling, having that vulnerability piece. I don't know if we really see that as much. I know that there are oftentimes some, we want to hear from people in focus groups, and here in Rhode Island, they did a listening and learning tour to help inform like a strategic plan, and all that stuff's really great. But I think we need even more of that to be able, I really like the term living experience. We want to hear from you right now. There's things that we need to be mindful of about what's working well, what's not working well for you.
Completely agree.
In your book, you wrote that reunification sometimes feels possible, but most days it feels like it's being held for ransom. Could you unpack what this means in today's child welfare context?
Yes. So this is directly from several of the moms in my book that shared the ups and downs of going through a CPS process, where sometimes there's hope, and then there's hopelessness, and then you feel really connected to your child, but then you might miss visitation, or case manager can't supervise your visitation, so you've missed a couple of now, so now you feel disconnected from your child. So just really going through the ups and downs of that process. And something that emerged was this idea of the power imbalances and the case planning process, and often providing case plan tasks for parents where they don't feel relevant. Some parents go through the process, go through the motions just to get their kids back, and it feels very transactional. And I think that continues to happen today. It wasn't just during the time period when I was in the field, where parents are feeling like these children that they birthed and love and take care of simply cannot be reunified with them until they do A, B, C, D, E, and F. And these items just don't feel relevant. They didn't have a say in those items. And some of those items actually are attempting to prescribe a way of life for these folks, right? I think I talk a lot about this when I train. We can't come in with our preconceived prescriptions of what families should be. I do think that if we have to be decisive about decisions for child safety, that's our job. We have to do that. But the overwhelming majority of the cases that we see are not these egregious cases that hit the media. So when we have these cases that come in that are dealing with trauma, family violence, and a relational disconnection going on with families, we can't decide who they should be and how they should function. And I think often people feel like these case plan tasks are, you tell me what to do, then I get my child back. And that does sound eerily like the child being held for ransom until you're able to really do what the system is asking you to do when you don't feel like that's your path to restoration or healing. And I think that that's what we need. We need parents to see the case planning path as this is really going to help my family. This is really going to help us heal. And I think we've missed that mark in our system.
Yeah, and there's definitely a shift in Rhode Island with the adoption of the SAFE model. But maybe, Holly, do you want to talk a little bit about how that has shifted away from the transactional relationship to more of a partnership and to more of including the family in the process and behavior change and them coming up with their own behavior change statement and stuff like that? You could speak to that much better than I could.
Yes. When I started back in 2005, I could relate to a lot of the things that you wrote in your book. The piece that you just said, transactional, a lot of it was a checklist, right? Even substance use. It was having screens with negative substance, check, right? That means everything is going to be great and everything's going to be fine. You're on your road to get your children back, things like that, right? And at the time, it could appear that there were a lot of hoops in the checklist, right? And they could complete one thing and then there would be another, right? And not necessarily what the needs of the family were. It was incident-based. Why did we become involved? What happened during that incident? And today we look more at not it's so being an incident, but, what are the needs of the family? And we do include the family, creating their service plans, looking at their strengths, who in your life can help you, whereas in the past, we limited a lot of the natural supports. Somebody having a record or maybe having been involved in the department in the past. A lot of people were excluded from being involved or supporting the family when we became involved. And today we look at things a lot differently. We try to keep the kids with kin. We do so many creative things in our placements so that children can be with family members, whereas in the past it was like, oh, they had a record from 30 years ago. They can't be with that person, right? So we have made great strides with the model that we use, and I have seen it personally. There is always room for improvement. Stan mentioned our listening and learning tours that we have. We have our director. She came in and was like, where are we? We need to talk to the parents. We need to talk to the community. What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? And this is going to be a little painful, but we need to hear this and we need to make some adjustments. So we've really made great strides with that. I definitely have to say that. Always room for improvement. A lot of the things you said too, just being the system itself, the court can always, let's say, be a little headache with some of the things that we do and a barrier as well. I'd like to hear some of your thoughts on the court. But yeah, still room for improvement. And we're still putting in our plans, our strategic plans. We're still working on it from our listening and learning tours, but it's still a continuous process and meeting with parents and communities, providers, and, how are we doing? What are we doing wrong? What are we doing right? What do you need? So it's more of a partnership with the parents than it was before. Definitely.
That is so encouraging to hear. And it reminds me of a training that I do. I do a training on deconstructing power theory and how power dynamics work in our system. And I talk about the three elements of power theory, where there's this hierarchical imbalance of power that is very clearly harmful, where you're abusing power, you're overpowering people, you're not listening to them at all. And then there's this sort of middle area where you negotiate power and you bargain with people and you give them a little bit of say so. You ask their opinion, but in the back of your mind, you're just asking them out of this phrase lip service. Like I asked them their opinion, but you're still going to decide what happens next. But I'm always telling folks we're trying to move over to this idea of shared and balanced power dynamics where you are a partner in the process and you are literally on a strength finding mission where your mission is to find the strength in this family and partner with them to add to that strength. So it sounds like you all have moved across that continuum of power theory. And as someone who's been talking about power theory for 10 years, I love to hear it.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I was thinking of too, is that like in terms of power, there's also the knowledge and information piece of power. And like we know that there's been this great progress that's been made in terms of partnering more with parents and families, but they might not. Chances are they probably don't. So their experience and what they've heard in the media and stuff like that is probably a lot of negative, and they have their own preconceived notions, and they're scared. They're thinking this system is still this antiquated way of doing things where they're going to be come and told what to do rather than working in partnership. So they don't know that. So there's that power imbalance too. It just comes to knowledge and information. And it sort of leads into another question that we had for you is that do you think that the system still forces parents to become hypervigilant? And in certain instances, is that maybe a good thing? I'm not saying it is or isn't, but I just want to kind of hear your opinion on that.
So if that is something that came out of the book, if I refer to hypervigilance in the book, I'm referring to parents that have said after they encounter the system, they feel a sense of unease. They feel very vulnerable. They feel overly surveilled. Like, if I make a mistake, will this happen again? And no one wants to feel like they're walking on eggshells, in their life, right? So I think the idea of hypervigilance that I'm talking about is the hypervigilance that's steeped in fear. And I think that, to your point, being hypervigilant, or I like to use the terminology, just being aware, of parenting things and being aware of new parenting principles and being aware of child safety. I think people should definitely be aware. Hypervigilance has a somewhat of a negative connotation to me where it's again latent with fear and anxiety. And I think a lot of the parents that I dealt with had that reaction after dealing with CPS. So no, I don't think that hypervigilance steeped in fear could be a good thing, but being more aware of self, being more aware of how to improve your relationship with your children and your connection to your community, I think would be amazing. But that's kind of the differentiation that I have.
Right. I agree. It's the connotation of especially I think of the highlighting hyper, right? It's becoming overly vigilant. I think we all want to help parents be, like you said, more aware and more vigilant or whatever. They're lacking in certain areas that are contributing to potential abuse and neglect, right? We want to help them fill those gaps, but we don't want them to become so overly aware and concerned about that leads to that fear that you're talking about, right? So just to shift kind of to, I know you mentioned it a little bit already, but to shift a little bit to self-care and tips and advice for the modern child welfare workforce. We know there's a lot of emphasis on self-care, right? But I know that you've experienced some of your own burnout. Can you speak to this at all? And like maybe what were some of the red flags and what were the lessons that you kind of learned from that? And like how would you maybe do things differently now that like let's say you're going back and re-traumatize yourself or something like that? How would you take care of yourself better?
Sure. I believe that when I was in the field, I was very focused on meeting deadlines, very focused on getting things done quickly, making sure that I didn't fall behind, making sure that we had these emails that would go out to show people, they had your name of people that hadn't submitted things. And we had this running joke about, I want to be on the list. And so that was a big part of me. It might be a type A sort of personality. So I think that if I were to be working in the field right now, I would tell folks to think about your job differently, because some people feel like type A immediately connects to efficiency and accuracy and competence. And that's not always the case. right? Being type A, again, is latent with nervousness, anxiety, and it's sort of fear based. I'm afraid to be on that list. And I don't think anyone should function like that, because you are much likelier to end up burnout and to end up sort of disenfranchised, at your job. So I would do it differently. I would focus on relationships with the parents on my caseload. I would focus on, again, less transactional, because I became very transactional when I was at the peak of my burnout. I was depleted. I didn't have the patience or the capacity to really lean into listening more and getting to understand what my families on my caseload really needed. It was, I need this. I need this signature. I need this done. I need this case plan test done. I need your, this is how I was at that point. When you start to get like that, folks that are listening in, I think it's a really good indication that you're heading toward burnout, where you only have the capacity to transact the people you're working with. And that could be families as well as colleagues. So I think thinking through, my colleagues that were a part of this writing process and a part of the book, we all agreed that we saw it in each other. We didn't have the skill set to say, hey, we all need to slow down and figure this out. We just kept running. We just kept trying to get things done. So I think having people around you, for the folks that are listening in, that can say to you, you're going to have to take a day. You're going to have to look at this differently, or I see something, what's going on? Let's stop and have lunch. And let's not have lunch in a way where we're throwing down our food, which is what we used to do, right? We told ourselves we're going to go sit at a restaurant, but then we're again, I'm going to use the word hypervigilant. We're hypervigilant while we're sitting at this restaurant trying to have a slower lunch hour. So I think having the people around you that are looking out for you, and keeping a close eye on how you're engaging with families and engaging with those people can really give you an idea of if you're depleted at the end of your capacity.
Yeah, I think that's all great, obviously, right? You slow down, more self-awareness. One thing that you mentioned too, talk about being deficit-based, the email going out about people who owe work. That is an interesting practice. I'm not sure how, that is helpful to people to be able to, it's really, constant. Talk about being transactional and being consequence-based and focused on, that. It's, yeah.
I don't
trying
know.
to gather my thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I don't know if that's still happening, but I think that during that time, it was a strategy of information. It was I need to inform you all of this deadline coming up. And if you're within a few days of that deadline, you're going to be on this list to say. So I think for them, their perception was we're just informing them. But our perception was we don't want to be on that list. So
yeah, and it's the same thing that if you try to extrinsically motivate a family that you're working with, chances are if they're not intrinsically motivated to change, and same thing with the worker, right? If they're not intrinsically motivated to be able to get their work done in a timely manner, then the extrinsic pressure is probably not going to be helpful if they're not intrinsically motivated. So
true.
Yeah. Along those lines, how do you think leadership and, again, along the lines of training, can continue to evolve to create lasting change, not just short-term shifts within child welfare organizations?
So I get to do a lot of leadership work right now in my role. And we talk about this concept where we don't just want the same few people making all the decisions. So we try to walk alongside agencies and somewhat teach them, cultivate this idea of bringing other people to the table to make decisions about training, to make decisions about any sort of systemic shifts that you're trying to make, so that your teams don't continually feel like these changes are happening to me without me. So that's one thing that I think leaders need to do more of. I think that it's very comfortable and easy to lean on your team and to constantly lean on the same people, but it is going to really impact the organization positively if we start to look out at the bright spots on our teams and say, hey, we want you to be a part of this next project. We want you to be a part of this next decision, or even what are your thoughts about this? It would make a big difference in how these changes and training evolution is coming down the pike for people. And I've seen that firsthand, where the more people that you brought in to the conversation, they're also influential to others that, are on your teams and in your units when you're trying to make those changes. So again, leadership is a huge thing right now with my work. And just, again, trying to embed distributive leadership practices and trying to develop leaders at all levels is a really big deal for us right now.
When you say distributive leadership practices, is that the sort of just bringing more people into this decision-making process that you were talking about?
Yeah. Making sure that decisions that are being made, particularly around training and morale and retention and turnover, that there's a distribution of varied amount of perceptions around the table for people that are going to be a part of that, and being able to have them weigh in, because typically leaders, I'm a leader myself, you lean on the people that you've always leaned on. What do you think about this? Can you help me with this? And we're trying to help them to come out of that a little bit and say, hey, have you thought about so-and-so from that department? Have you thought about this supervisor we have this mindset of they're too busy, they're supervisors. And I get it, they are busy, but we have seen amazing things happen when we tell a supervisor, hey, do you want to join this committee and help us kind of figure out how to boost morale? I mean, it really does really change the dynamic. And it's not people constantly thinking, oh, they make all the decisions and we have to conform to it.
Yeah. Is there any sort of pushback that you get, or in your mind, is there a balance that does need to happen in turn? Like, because you could go maybe a little bit, somebody might argue, right, that you're going too far in the other direction, where now we have too many cooks in the kitchen, and now we have too many voices at the table, and now we have paralysis analysis, and the wheels of change are moving ever slower. So do you get any of that kind of pushback when people say, well, we can't include everyone and we need to be able to move forward with decisions? And how do you encourage people to kind of find that balance, particularly like leadership and those in like decision-making positions?
Yeah, that's a facilitation skill. You're absolutely right. And we work on that as well. We get to partner with agencies for long-term, up to 3 years. And during that time, we say it looks like we could bring in some training on facilitation, because as a facilitator, you need to be able to balance hearing perspectives, but pushing the meeting forward. So we are constantly trying to develop the people around the table. So I'm in these meetings, and if I pick up on something of, oh, we've been admiring this problem for too long, that's what I call it. We're admiring this problem, we're running around it. I have a conversation with some of the heads of the organization to say, it sounds like facilitation could be a really great developmental tool for this group. And then we move toward that. So you're absolutely right. Without cultivating their skills, meetings could last all day. You're absolutely right. Because there's so many folks in the meeting and everyone has a thought. But facilitation is definitely a skill. And a lot of people don't take the time to be trained on how to do that, and to be trained on how to look at a meeting, start on time, end on time, and make sure people feel like that wasn't a waste of their time. And that's all learned in facilitation.
Yeah, the meeting about the meeting conundrum, right? That's a big problem that we have, right?
I think it's so important too, just for staff to feel as if they're being heard, that their opinions are being asked. Oftentimes I've been in a role where there's been changes in an organization, and the people that do the job are like, no one asked us about this, and we do this every day. Why are they making these changes that don't make sense, right? I definitely have had that experience. And one of the things with our listening and learning tour was the director came in with her team and talked to staff. And I was a part of that. And I remember being like, why has no one ever done this before? Like, how come no one has come in and asked me what's going well? What are my thoughts? What are my suggestions? What do I think we can improve? It's so basic, but it just made such an impact to feel valued as a worker, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, because without that, you never know what you never know. You never will feel like your voice matters, or that you were included in something. And just being able to extend the invitation to someone to something like that, I think instantly makes them feel more included and involved in the conversation. Even if they don't go, and if they go and they don't even say anything, at least they were there and they could listen and absorb the information, and they felt a part of it, a part of the process, as opposed to before, where they were not included at all on any of the decisions or anything like that, right? So,
and another thing that we remind the folks we're working with is it's an invitation. It's not volunteering people. It's not forcing them, because some people hear the invitation and say, I don't have the capacity to be a part of your task force. But it's the idea of going to them and saying, I would love to invite you to be a part of this. but you have the agency to say, I can't do that right now, right? And some people do. So I think when you start volunteering people, then you might get people to say, well, I don't have time for this. I don't want to do this. But more often than not, they join. But we have had a couple of folks that said, oh, I can't do it right now, but I really appreciate being asked. Can I think about somebody else? Can I have a delegate go on my behalf? And to me, that's even them showing a sense of ownership of their time and awareness of what they can handle.
Yeah, because I'm sure a lot of people feel that invisible pressure or guilt or whatever to join that committee or something like that. And again, it's like that extrinsic motivation where it's like, you don't really, deep down, you don't really want to go to this meeting, but you're going because you feel guilty, or you're going because you feel like you should be part, or somebody invited you, so you feel like you can't disappoint them or something like that. But at the end of the day, your attention and your focus and all of your efforts are not going to be 100% in it because you kind of really don't want to be there to begin with. So. Yeah. Sort of a final question. You talked a lot about the racial disparities in child welfare in your book. What do you think are the most actionable steps agencies can take right now to begin understanding and addressing this in their practices and policies? And I would also add, like, on an individual level too, for the frontline workers, for people that are just working directly with families, like. We know that there's always a lot that can be done around implicit bias and your own self-awareness and stuff like that. But maybe just from the individual up to the organizational level, what could people be doing more of in terms of addressing some of the racial disparities that we know are present in child welfare?
Yeah, well, I'll try not to talk for another hour on this topic, but I will share that I do quite a bit of training around this, and my goal in it is to really impact awareness. I think that it's very clear that all of us have bias, and the more aware you are about that and the more honest you are about that, I think that it will not negatively impact what happens to the families on your caseload. And once you're honest about it and you're aware of it, I often tell folks on an individual level, have people you can go to and talk to about it. I've had some agencies create these courageous conversation circles on a monthly basis where they want people to get together and talk about what's coming up for them. And some things are hard to hear, right? I'll give you an example. You know, I was talking to a leader that has courageous conversation sessions, and a caseworker in this session said, I saw this mom. She's an African-American and she's on SNAP benefits. You know, she's getting help with her food insecurity, and she had her nails done. And I felt a way about that. So she shared this in this session, and people were uncomfortable with the fact that she sort of made this judgment about someone having a manicure, but also getting public assistance. But the amazing part about that is she said it. And I think that organizations have to have a level of trust and relational connection where somebody can say something like that and not feel like they're going to be berated and attacked. On the contrary, you're going to be held accountable and you're going to have a learning opportunity where people can really listen to you and to hold you accountable for not letting that belief about this mom negatively impact that case. So I think, again, you said individual up to system. I think individually, be connected to folks that you can trust to share things, because we all have thoughts about things that we don't want to share. But if you continue to hold it in, I think it could impact what you do on your cases. That's why I always encourage people to try to find someone to talk to about that. Go to someone and ask, could you look at this from your vantage point? Because I want to make sure that I'm not reading into this. Like, having that question for a colleague is fair, to say, I had this mom on a previous case, so I'm having some thoughts about her. I already know her, but can you look at this and make sure I'm not clouding what I'm going to do next with my thoughts? So that's a good individual strategy that I've helped people, use. And as far as system level, I can't talk enough about leadership being aware of their data. And anything they do around equity or disparities are led by data. I work with an organization right now. They're doing some equity-oriented strategies. And when their organization, I'm going to say push back or ask, how are we doing this? It's very simple to have that through line. So we'll look at our data and look at how Native American families are faring in our system. Look how Black families are faring. And that's why we're doing this. So I think courageous leadership is having rationale for creating these changes and not just having people almost spinning their wheels in the mud and not understanding why they're doing what they're doing around disparity. So having a grasp on the data and then the courage to do something about that.
Yeah, it's creating that ability for someone to feel safe when they are being more vulnerable, like we talked about in the beginning, right? Like, and that self-awareness piece, I think, is so huge too, because I think a lot of us, we will let our emotions maybe get in the way, especially when it comes to this kind of work. And but I'm not doing direct service work anymore, but even today, I had to text somebody that I trust to say, like, am I overreacting about this? Or like, am I being rational or am I being irrational? Right. Like just to kind of take a beat and think about that. And
Absolutely.
yeah,
It's a
goes
great
a long
example.
way.
It's literally asking a colleague,
Yeah.
am I overreacting to this? Or
Right.
am I bringing in my last case with this mom into her new case, which is hard not to do, right? When you've seen a mom three
Right.
times in a year. I've had case managers tell me that when I interview them. So that's when you need to lean on someone else to make sure that, that bias isn't coming through to what you do right now.
Yeah, because we all have different perspectives and points of view, and it might be if it's somebody that you trust, they will tell you either yes or no, right? Like, I think you're looking at this. Maybe you need to change your view on this, or you need to adapt your way of thinking about this, or yes, you are overreacting, or whatever. Somebody that's going to give it to you straight, right? Like somebody that you can trust. So, yeah. Ollie, do you have any final questions?
No, I don't have any final questions. Just to kind of bring it back again, I could relate to a lot of the things that you wrote in the book about, being the worker and the workload. And, there's been so many positive and different changes now in the field. So the workers don't experience a lot of the things that I did. Work is balanced out a lot more. Like we didn't have laptops then, right? So to do documentation was very different. And, I did experience burnout as a worker. I related to so much of what you said with I wasn't taking care of myself physically. I wasn't going to doctor's appointments because I didn't have time to do that because I was working all the time. And, you talked about a nightmare in your book as well that you had. And so similar with, I was having headaches and nightmares and just spiraled. And I remember being at a doctor's appointment and it was a physical. And she's like, I think I should write you out of work. And I started crying and I said, I can't. I have too much work to do. Now I look at it and I'm like, how does this make any sense, right? That I'm like, I can't, then someone else is going to get my work and I don't want to do that because I know they're stressed out as well. And just, now I can look at it and just, it's almost comical, but in living it, it was not. And, I work with a lot of the new workers that come in and I'm just constantly telling them to, be mindful of themselves and where they are in their bodies, especially physically. How are they responding to things and their senses and just all of that, the well-being and the self-care. And so I'm hoping that things are different for the staff that we have now. But I really appreciated your stories in the book. And I'm thankful that you did share your personal experience, as well as the parents that you did work with and the families that you did work with. So I want to just thank you for that.
Yeah, no problem. And it does sound like things are different for the folks that you're working with. And that's why we do what we do. That's why I do what I do. I'm still trying to make sure that the next wave of people that come into our field aren't dealing with the things that we had to deal with, right? And they have more tools and they have more support. The stronger your workforce is, the better off children and families will be. And that's just logic. And that's what I want people to realize. The workforce can't be an afterthought, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think we have to be able to give ourselves and each other permission to take care of ourselves. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we just keep making excuse after excuse and keep continuing to feel that vicious cycle of guilt and shame that it's going to affect others, it's going to affect the families. But you've heard it a million times, but it's that oxygen mask metaphor, right? You can't put your oxygen mask on the child or the person you're sitting next to on the plane first. You have to put it on yourself first. So there's still work that needs to be done around that. Dr. Price, thank you so much. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with our audience?
Well, I will share a quote that, I often share with folks. It certainly inspires me, but it's a proverb and it says, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the next best time is right now. So I just want to remind the folks that are listening that it's not too late to change course. It's not too late to take command over your, well-being. It's what you start doing right now is really going to impact the future of our work and the future of the community and the families we serve. So don't wait. I know we should have started a long time ago, but it's okay. We can start right now.
Absolutely. And I see it as, even though you might not see the fruits of it, you're planting the seed, right? And that's what needs to be done. So.
Thank you all so much.
Well said, and I think there's so many similarities too between what we've talked about in terms of ourselves and then the work that actually gets done with the families, right? We could just say the same exact thing to a family, like, what better time is there to change than right now? Like, we don't have to dwell on the past. We can change things moving forward, and we're working together and building this partnership. So thank you so much, Dr. Price. Appreciate it.
Thank you all.